All right. Good morning, afternoon, whenever you're actually viewing this. I wanted to take a minute and have a little chat about redistricting and specifically just helping people understand some of the terms that we use very commonly that I think are really hard to understand unless you know why they're being used. And I want to walk you through that based on kind of principles that we hold about redistricting and thinking what those principles actually mean. There's a lot that goes into redistricting or deciding how our new maps are drawn so that we elect the representatives based on our common interests. But a lot of redistricting actually isn't very intuitive. And there's a great talk that I've linked here in the slides from Mira Bernstein, who is a mathematics PhD, who talks about why some of the assumptions we have about redistricting don't actually hold and why it's so complicated to make court decisions about redistricting. So I think we need to talk about two different elements that we assume are both important in redistricting and how they actually affect what happens in our local districts. So these two concepts are the idea that representation is directly proportionate, and the other idea is that all districts should be competitive. So let's talk about how moving towards either of those would influence how our districts are drawn and what the outcomes would be. So what is directly proportionate representation? This is the idea that if a party wins 55% of the vote, they get 55% of the representatives. If they win 60% of the vote, they get 60% of the representatives. So the idea that there's a direct linear correlation between proportion of votes won and proportion of seats won. Mathematically, straight line. What does that actually mean if we think about how we would create that system? What do we have to do so that we would have proportionate representation? Well, the easiest way to actually think about it is to design ourselves a state. So here's Squarelandia. Squarelandia is actually a rectangle, but we're going to roll with it. So in Squarelandia, most of the people who are in the blue party live on the left. Most of the red people live on the right. That was unintentional. However, what you can see is that in the middle, there's a mixing of the population so that while we have mostly blue on the left and mostly red on the right, there's an actual even gradation across Squarelandia. And when they elect their representatives, they have chosen to divide Squarelandia vertically. So that means they have 10 different representatives and 5 of them are blue and 5 of them are red. So if Squarelandia did not have 50% blue and red voters, what would this look like? Well, if Squarelandia had 60% blue voters and 40% red voters, then they'd have 6 blue representatives and 4 red representatives. And if they had 70% blue voters and 30% red voters, they'd have 7 blue representatives and 3 red representatives. So this is directly proportionate. And each district is electing based on the proportion of blue and red voters in that district. So what's actually happening, if we look at the proportion of the districts, the percent blue voters is uniformly distributed across all districts. So we have 0% blue voters in one, we have 100% blue voters in another, and we have just a gradation of percent of blue voters across all of our districts. So what does that mean about how will that impact whether you can change your representative in your own district? So how often does the district that is 100% blue ever see a red representative? In order for that to happen, 100%, almost 100% of the voters would actually have to put their vote, right? So it would be very uncommon that that very blue district would ever elect a red representative. And the very red district would be very unlikely to ever elect a blue representative. So those districts, your representative will change in your primary election because that's a blue versus blue or a red versus red election, but it's very unlikely to change in a general election, right? Policy-wise, you're looking at a blue versus a blue or a red versus a red, but you're not those districts in the middle where it's almost 50% blue or almost 50% red, those districts are going to see a lot of change in whether a red or a blue representative is elected, because as the electorate shifts a little bit, those districts are much more likely to see a transition from red to blue or blue to red. So some of these districts have, it's very easy to change which party is representing the district, and some of these districts, it's very hard to change which party is representing at an individual district level. Even though overall, what we're seeing is that this representation changes as the overall population changes their votes. So in this situation, there are a few districts that were very competitive and some districts that were not very competitive at all. What if every district was competitive, right? So what if every district was, in political terms, a swing district? What would we have to do to Squarelandia to have every district be a swing district? Well, that's actually pretty easy. Instead of dividing it vertically, we divide it horizontally. Now, if Squarelandia has 50% blue and 50% red, each single district also has 50% blue and 50% red. So which districts have blue and which districts have red representation, if there are 50% blue and 50% red, is just kind of a random choice or based on the individual preferences in that district. So in this case, you'd have 5 red representatives and 5 blue representatives. But what happens to Squarelandia in this situation if instead of having 50% blue voters and 50% red voters, they actually had 60% blue voters and 40% red voters? Then every single representative from every district is going to be blue. And it's actually going to be very hard to elect a red representative. So there's going to be a 40% of the population that really feels like they are not represented, and they're not going to be represented at any level of government, because whether they're voting overall, it's 60% blue, or within an individual district, it's also 60% blue. So in this case, they would not have a lot of representation. However, if the districts were all at 50%, those would be competitive. They would all be able to be flipped very easily. So if we think about centering districts so that they're 50% each party, what we actually end up with is it's only very malleable as long as that average is truly 50%. Otherwise, we're going to shift where that mean is, and then you will see a swing so that all your representatives are one party or all your representatives are another party. Yeah, so a very small shift in political preferences completely removes the representation from the other party. So there are lots of different ways you could break up Squarelandia, right? Here's another way I want to show you. So instead of doing only the proportionate districts, or only the districts that are an average of everyone within Squarelandia, in this case, I drew 3 vertical districts, and I specifically drew them all in the most blue area of Squarelandia. And then I took the 7 horizontal districts and drew them in the rest of what was left. So now Squarelandia is still 50% blue and 50% red, but it has only 3 blue representatives and it has 7 red representatives. So Squarelandia should have 5 red and 5 blue representatives, but instead it is disproportionately represented by red representatives. And actually, if I switch to 60% blue, 60% blue voters, I still only have 3 blue representatives and 7 red ones. I'd actually have to go to 70%, given the numbers that I'm just throwing out here, 70% blue voters in order to flip from 3 representatives to 7. So what have I actually done here? Let's go back to the 50%. I have actually taken the blue voters and squished them all into 3 districts, right? Or a lot of them all into 3 districts. I've packed them in. And then I've taken the remaining blue voters, because they're still out there. We can see those aren't fully red districts. And I have spread them out between all the other districts. So I have cracked them. So now I have both the packed sections and the cracked sections. And now you'll see I've actually flipped into the terms you're hearing a lot. And I think it's really hard to think, well, we tend to think of packing and cracking as something, the idea that, oh, there's this perfect density and we've either squished too much or we spread out too much. But in reality, what we've done is both, right? So there are too many blue people squished into 3 districts and the rest are all spread out among the other 7 districts. So we keep in mind that we aren't looking overall to say people are too squished or too spread out overall. It really matters the proportion of people who are compacted into districts where they're the majority of one party, and the proportion of people who are spread out, rather than just looking at it as a binary, too much packing or too much cracking. And I think that's something that when political folks talk about it, we tend to understand quickly because we stare at this a lot. But I don't think this is a concept that has gotten transmitted very well, that this is what's happening. When you take something that is 50% blue and 50% red, and you put the majority of the blue voters into a few districts, you actually make all the other districts red. So you end up with this disproportionate representation. But also we just need to think about when we talk about having all of our districts be in that middle range where they're all flippable, what that would actually look like when we execute it, and what can happen if you execute that when your average district isn't actually 50-50. What is that going to mean for representation in the minority versus whether we actually expect proportionate representation, which I think as we continue talking, you'll see likely proportionate representation, directly proportionate representation. So 1-to-1 percent of votes versus percent of representation is actually very hard to achieve. And I think I will post this now and hopefully do another one later in the week. But I just want to remind folks, again, there are multiple events happening to educate folks on redistricting and actually give people an opportunity to come out and speak and let folks know what matters to you as this redistricting process goes forward. And I would encourage everyone to follow your local representatives, ask for information, go to these meetings, try to make sure that you're aware of what's happening and your voice is actually heard in this decision-making process.